what are you going to do to defend your faith? Well, for goodness sake, don't quote scripture in public, giving chapter and verse. That's not the way you do it. You begin with questions. In fact, put on your fridge QQQ, or if you want it written, don't make statements, ask questions. It's the last thing you see when you go out in the morning. Questions work. Let me give you an example of how they work. You will be asked by some of your mentors to do things which are deeply immoral for you, like take part in abortion, do euthanasia. If you're an obedient Catholic, assist in contraception. Now, when you're asked to do these things, don't immediately say no. You're in a position that's lower than that. But you can say, before I obey you, may I ask you a question? And this is the question. If you make me do this, which you have the power to do, you will force me to do something which is against my conscience. And in so doing, you will diminish me as a person for the rest of my life. Do you really want to do that? No one does. And deep down, they know, as Jay Budziszewski puts it in his lovely book, what we can't not know. We all can't not know that something like the Ten Commandments are true at a deep level. And you can go on and say, there are lots of people who share your position, but there are also lots of people who share mine. Don't both groups have a right to a physician who shares their most basic commitments? No, you haven't made a statement. You've only asked questions. And at the worst, they will simply let it go without doing any more. So learn to ask questions. Who are the best teachers of questions? Well, Jesus and Socrates. The key questions that I say you've got to be able to answer are reductionism, relativism, all four versions, multiculturalism, sanctity of life. These things you've got to be able to deal with. And Peter Kraft, in his little book, The Best Things in Life, has already written an imagined dialogue between you and Socrates, in which these issues, except reductionism, which he doesn't specifically believe with, are dealt with in dialogue, and Socrates changes the student's point of view without making a statement. Brilliant. That's what you need to learn to do. Practice questions, and you can always tell your story. That's important to recognize. Stories are powerful. And you can tell other people's stories. And in medicine, case histories are acceptable because everybody knows that's the way medicine grew. So hold on to good stories. The best ones that you can get are when an atheist is telling the truth. They're gold. Hold on to them. For instance, when you're talking about evolution, the best person by far, in my view, is David Stove, who was Australia's best analytical philosopher, an atheist who committed suicide when he got cancer. But he was also extremely rigorous and honest. And he wrote a book called Darwinian Fairy Tales, which is hilariously funny and very destructive of the Darwinian cause. Because, as Stove says, he understood that you can't get an ought from an is. They do it by subtlety when they say, if you want to catch that train, you ought to leave now. But that's not an ought from an is. But you can't get from, even if, imagine I have invented a cure for a cancer which you have, you can't get from those two facts to the command, give it to you, without inserting something we forget, that it's my job to love as a Christian. And it's the love which makes the giving. If I was a Darwinian and you are wealthy and I inherit your estate and nobody knows I've got this cure yet, why wouldn't I let you die first, the immediate winnings, and then announce my cure, which will take 10 years to get on the market? As a Darwinian, that would be advancing my genes, which is what evolution does. And David Stove is utterly convinced you cannot have a moral culture from a Darwinian foundation. Book to give away to ardent but unthinking Darwinists. There's more happening in that area than most people realize. The best book I've read recently, well, I'm still finishing it. I got it for Christmas and I've almost finished it, some 300 pages or so, is by Carl Trueman on how our world has been changed into a subjective world, the history of it. Brilliantly done, well worth reading. So learn to ask questions, learn to tell your own story winsomely, and use others as well. Let me give you two examples of that. Let's start with a little book called The Window on Heaven by Diane Comp. I've met Diane a few times. We're on the same page. We know about one another. She's retired now from Yale and went off to work in West Africa. Whether she survived or not, I don't know. But like me, she grew up in a Christian home, went to university, and faith was sidelined. She got into more trouble than me. I flirted with Marxism and got over that by going behind the Iron Curtain. That cured me of Marxism. Especially I went climbing, so climbing with a guy from behind the Iron Curtain in the middle of a rock face, they tend to be honest. She became an existentialist and believed that life has no ultimate meaning, so you do what gives you pleasure. And what gave her pleasure was children, and she was very smart, intimidating to the rest of the guys in her class, and she knew she was highly unlikely to get married, so she did pediatrics. Foolishly, she ended up doing oncology, so some of the children she loved died. But what do you say to a dying child if you believe that life has no meaning? You don't have anything to say. So she let the social workers get neurotic, and she didn't go. But her mom kept turning on the back of her head and saying, Diane, I didn't bring you up to desert children you love. You ought to be there. In the end, she gave in. The first child she sat with, a little girl about 8, dying of leukemia. Mom and dad sitting there by the bed, and the hospital chaplain who actually ran away as soon as things started to happen. He didn't have the wherewithal to handle what was going on. But children quite often have lucid intervals just before they die. Basically saying goodbye, I guess. Anyway, this little girl woke up and she said, Mummy, can you see the angels? Can you hear them singing? It's beautiful. And she was gone, just like that. She wasn't in pain, in anxiety. She had seen where she's going. I presume she'd seen an angel or seen the Lord, but she'd seen something beautiful and she just wanted to get there. Arms wide open to greet her, and she just ran, so to speak. And of course, for the parents, that was a wonderful comfort in their bereavement. They suffered bereavement, but they had a sure and certain hope that they would meet again. Diane didn't give in. The hospital chaplain, I say, ran away. This was too much for him. But it took 2 more children to bring her to faith, and I won't spoil the story for you. Get the book. Whenever you see it in a second-hand bookshop, buy it and give it to somebody who needs it. You can get rid of them at regular intervals if you're doing pediatrics, certainly, but medicine in general. A wonderful book to give to people who have a real heart, but not their mind needs turning on. She does a wonderful job. Now, in my case, I had one of those stories, but I'll delay it a little bit because I want to put it into a bigger context. The most powerful way I have found of defending my faith is being able to draw people into it from where they are, not from where I want them to be. And the best way of doing this, I call the 4 levels of happiness. I got it from Robert Spitzer, who's a marvelous Jesuit who taught quantum physics and theology and prayed like a Pentecostal. And when I heard his version, which he said he got from the Greeks, with lots of Greek words in it, I asked him, I said, Robert, can I make an earthy version for medical students? Because the Greek words will put people off. And he said, sure, go ahead. So I did. And a few years later, actually, I got a book through the post called The 4 Levels of Happiness, written by another Jesuit. And it was dedicated to Robert Spitzer and myself. The story is lovely, but there isn't time to tell you. So the 4 levels of happiness. I share this probably with every third person I sit next to on an airplane. You know, you go through the usual good morning, good afternoon, where are you going, how's your family, what do you do? And when it gets to what you do, they say, well, what do you do? And I say, well, it's a bit hard to describe. You could say that I talk about ethics, culture, faith, and public policy, and talk about why we need to integrate them if we're going to survive and not divide up into identity politics. They say, that's a bit of a mouthful. I said, well, are you interested? I'd start with happiness. Everybody wants to be happy, don't they? Do you know that it's profitable to think about happiness in 4 layers? No. Are you interested? Yes. And then I say, and you should do the same. This is dangerous to you, you know, this could change your life. So if you realize it's dangerous and you don't want to go there, just say stop and I will. I call level 1 happiness animal happiness. That's the happinesses we share with the animals. And basically this comes down to food and sex. I live on a farm. Until last year we kept Herefords here. I'm getting too old to run around in the snow, so we have no Herefords now. But as long as they had food, water, and a very occasional bull, they were fine. They could push down any fence I built. I mean, they're over 1,000 pounds, a lot of them, but they don't. They're placid in that sense, and they have sex in public with no concern about it at all. We're different from the animals in that sense. We are beginning to get more like the animals. They eat everything in sight. As long as it's only ordinary food, they're safe. We can kill them with the food we give them. In fact, if cows have access to finishing diets without us knowing, they'll get fatty liver and die. But what's happened in your lifetime, in my lifetime, I should say, is that we have screwed up on both sex and eating habits. And when you abuse them, they turn into an unhappiness, not happiness. Sex disconjoined from committed love will shortly become first boring and then perverted. That's what happens. One group of people who don't read any books on how to improve their sex life are virgins who marry virgins, and they have the best sex for the longest time, and it's so good that the people who talk about these things pretend they don't exist, but they do. Screwing up with eating to deal with our anxieties and the like is beyond belief, isn't it? And it's going to be a major part of your life. There was no obesity in Britain after the Second World War. It's not your glands, although it is your energy moderating mechanisms. Again, we can't talk about that at the moment. So abusing food or sex will lead to unhappiness too, unhappiness 1. You have to go up a level to happiness 2, which is what Socrates wanted the university to be about, a place where you learn wisdom. You learn what the good life is and how to live it. That's what he wanted university to be about. But I doubt that any of you have ever gone away from a class saying, I felt wiser at the end of that class than I'd ever felt before in my life. That's what Socrates wanted. But instead, within weeks of arriving in medical school, you're turned into neurotics. So much so that we have to have one professor in any medical school that you can go to and tell them that you're abusing alcohol and drugs to deal with your anxiety and you need help, and you'll get it without it appearing in your transcript, because we need to get you through to being a doctor. But it's a huge problem. Didn't used to be. And so what should be a wonderful journey of discovery and building a intellectual foundation for your life turns into a neurotic memorize and dump program, which is disgusting. The only thing now is to go up to happiness 3, which is the happiness that comes when you serve. The best example is getting married and having children. They're not pure continuous joy, but they become central to your lives, and serving them gives you immense pleasure. Women get more of it earlier on. They're built for it in ways that men have to learn, and they know without even thinking. But you do it together. And when they leave, the empty nest syndrome is a real unhappiness. You can do medicine in that way. Pour yourself into patients beyond the call of duty, and every now and again you win big time. They remember you forever, you remember them forever. It's what makes it all worthwhile. To save somebody's life, knowing there are very few people in the world who would have saved that life, it's a wonderful feeling. And we're made for that. We're made for service. The best service, of course, is described in morning prayer in the Anglican prayer book, describing Christ, whose service is perfect freedom. We're made to serve. We will serve. The only question is whether we serve in heaven or hell. Now, when you get to unhappiness 3, which busyness can bring you to, retirement, the empty nest syndrome, chronic disease, whatever it is, this is the moment of truth. Diane Combe described it in The Children. For me, I'll just use an example from my own experience. Having done my PhD in cell physiology, working on sodium transport, my wife rather enjoyed the time I was doing a PhD because I was home instead of seeing patients till 8 o'clock at night. And when I finished, she said, "Can't you go on with the research life a bit longer in a nice place? You promised me we'd travel." So I went through the world literature and found that malnourished children had a defect. They must have a defect. Nobody had documented it because I'd invented a new technique that made that possible. So I went to the Wellcome Trust and showed them what I could do. And they said, "Fine, we'll pay." And I went to Jamaica for 2 years and stayed for 7, and was with a wonderful unit there. And I was there, it took 25 years, but I was there for the last 7. And we had the great privilege of finishing the job, writing the definitive protocols for the proper treatments of severe malnutrition for all time. I actually put the last piece in the puzzle, which was really delightful. And that was where I began to come to life as students picked up that I had some questions for the Marxism which was rampant on campus, Castro being only 90 miles away. And so we went to church, and I brought students home, and basically to straighten out their minds. And I didn't think much of it, but it came back in many beautiful ways later. I didn't realize what was going on. And then we came to Canada. I still had questions about malnutrition and about sodium transport in that setting. And I looked around for problems in the Department of Pediatrics and found them in cystic fibrosis. 30 years ago, patients dying of cystic fibrosis were malnourished for the last 2 years of their lives, but nobody really noticed it was just the normal natural history of cystic fibrosis. But now I had the view that this particular bit could be ameliorated at least. And so I jumped through the hoops, and to cut a long story short, we put the first permanent feeding tube into a CF child 30 years ago. And now it's a routine procedure in any decent clinic. Well, 15 or 20% of the kids will have a feeding tube to get extra calories at night. This is not the place to discuss that, but obviously when I decided the problem was there, I needed to do some experiments to see whether whether I could reverse it and whether it's worth doing. So I jumped through the hoops to get permission to ask for patients to volunteer. The first volunteer was a 15-year-old boy, a farmer's son with a body mass of an 11-year-old. And when he heard that I wanted to try and build muscle, he was knocking on my door. And I said to him, "Look, you're saying you want to do this before I told you what I want to do. And to do it, I need to put a tube through your nose into your stomach for at least a month. Now, given your cough, it's going to have to be replaced a lot, probably 100 times in a month. Can you handle that?" And he said, "Sure." And he never complained. About halfway through the month, one Sunday, he coughed up his tube around the middle of the day. And the nurses called and said, "We've got so many admissions. We're not going to put the tube back till this evening. So if you want your protocol followed, you have to come and put it in yourself." I said, "Fine." I drove into the hospital. When I got to his bed, I was wearing a suit. I'd been to church. He was a smart lad. He said, "Oh, been to church?" I said, "Yes." "Do you go to church?" He said, "Yes." I'd never asked him before. It turned out he was Catholic and I was Protestant, and I said no more. I was well trained in the liberal environment that I'd grown up in, medical environment. You don't talk about these things. Leave it to the chaplain. But so I went home. But the next week, his mother stopped me in the corridor and said, "You had an opportunity on Sunday to talk to Stephen about faith, and you didn't use that opportunity. You should have done. You do it very well." She had no evidence to that statement. That was pure prophecy on her part. And of course, I took no notice. And it didn't work for Stephen. He got a few 100 grams. He wanted kilograms. But there were teething problems. We got over those. But I had become friends with Stephen. And 4 years later, I got a call that he was in hospital again. And he was 19. When I went to his room, he was clearly dying. His mom was sitting by his bed. He hadn't said anything for a couple of hours, but when I came in, he said, "Good, sit down, I want to talk to you." And I said, "What can I do for you, Stephen? I'm sorry you're so sick." And he said, "It says in the Bible, if you ask anything in my name, I'll give it to you. I'm 19 and I'm dying and I don't want to. What do you say? What would you do?" I wanted to get out of there, but I couldn't. I was a friend, so I had to play for time. I said, I tried the creeds. Of course, he believed the creeds. We had that in common. But the problem was it wasn't helping. I needed help, and so I was praying at the same time. And there's one prayer that you will use frequently in your career: help. The good Lord usually does very quickly, as he did in this case. Into my head popped Annie Dillard, Pilgrim at Tinker's Creek. It turned out it was a footnote. Oh yes, God will provide for all your needs, but do read the small print. He decides what your needs are, not you. I knew what to say. I already pointed out to Stephen that there were children running on that ward who wouldn't have been able to walk but for what he'd done, keeping their body mass up. Little boys who still managed to skate for a minute who would only be watching. That's a big thing in a small boy. And I said to him, "Stephen, I think God is saying something like this to you. Stephen, you have done all that I want you to do. You have done much good for other people, but you have coughed enough. It's time to come home. Both you and I know that unless there's a miracle, you're going to die in the next little while. Because God is the permissive will behind this, can you accept that this will be a good thing?" And there was a profound silence, and then he looked up and said, "Thank you. I think I can." I've never enjoyed a smile more than that one. And it still brings tears to my eyes to think about it. I'm looking forward to the day when I thank him. His mother had not finished with me. She was praying, I'm sure. But a few weeks later, she wrote me a note, which I kept and lost for 20 years, found it a couple of years ago. And I made it a little more flow a little better than the real thing did. I'll keep she's worthy of the best one anyway. She wrote, in effect, "It was ironic you were not allowed to give Stephen food for his body, but thank God you were there when he needed food for his soul." He'd been asking that question of his priest, his family, his doctor, and everybody had pushed it away, saying, "Stephen, you're not dying. You don't need to think about that yet." He knew he was. No, it wouldn't have made much difference to Stephen, would it, whether I was there or not? I mean, he was going to have it answered the best possible way in 3 hours' time. No, it was for his mother and for me. His mother had 3 children with CF. She was going to see all her children die. That's not easy. He said to me sometime later, if God had told me what he wanted me to do beforehand, I would have said, I can't do that, but it's all right. It's all right. And for me, of course, it was a huge guilt trip, as I realized I hadn't had a conversation like that for 20 years. I learned within a week or two of another child that we put a tube into died asking that question, and it hadn't been answered. And I knew that in a liberal school like ours, unless a senior professor was willing to and able to say that's not the right way to do it, they wouldn't do it. So that was the beginning of an entirely new career. So that's Happiness 4, knowing God. Don't tell them what it is, just tell them if you go looking for it, you'll find it. Do start reading some history. Keep the Sabbath, because if you can't get through school, do your job and keep the Sabbath, you're overstretched. It's not good. It's easy to get promoted beyond your abilities. You should stay within the abilities God has given you and keep his law. He knows what he's doing. And I want to finish by reading 2 quotations. Normally I was intending to read the one earlier, but I'll read it now. This is Polanyi talking about why medicine's changed. We had a moral consensus when I was a student. Now I've even been in a medical school where a Christian said to me, I don't trust anyone in my year. That makes it very difficult to do good medicine. But this is Michael Polanyi writing about, it could be medicine, but he calls it the adherents of a great tradition, in our case medicine, are largely unaware of their own premises, which lie deeply embedded in the unconscious foundations of practice. If citizens are dedicated to certain transcendent obligations, and particularly to such general ideals as truth, justice, charity, and these are embedded in the tradition of the community which allegiance is maintained, a great many issues between citizens, and all to some extent, can be left and are necessarily left for individual consciences to decide. The moment, however, a community ceases to be dedicated to its members to transcendent ideals, it can continue to exist undisrupted only by submission to a single center of unlimited secular power. We're talking about this in relation to COVID too. Now, I haven't filled in all the blanks. I'm told there will be a question period, so you can give me an opportunity to fill in many of the blanks. But just in case the question period vanishes, I want to finish with my favorite account of what the practice of medicine should look like. His name is in the index of any decent textbook of internal medicine. It becomes every man who purposes to give himself to the care of others seriously to consider the following things. First, that he must one day give an account to the supreme judge of all the lives entrusted to his care. Secondly, that all his skill and knowledge and energy, as they have been given by God, so they should be used for his glory and the good of mankind, and not for mere gain or ambition. Thirdly, and not more beautifully than truly, let him reflect that he has undertaken the care of no mean creature. For in order that he may estimate the value, the greatness of the human race, the only begotten Son of God became himself a man, and thus ennobled it with his divine dignity, and far more than this, died to redeem it. And fourthly, that the doctor being himself a mortal man, he should be diligent and tender in relieving his suffering patients, inasmuch as he himself must one day be a like sufferer. That's Thomas Sydenham from the 17th century, a Puritan Christian, a wonderful man, the first person to work out how to dose people with opium to deal with pain in what would be regarded as a modern way. He also took histories and followed them up. So he is really the nearest to a modern Hippocrates. I hope what you've heard is helpful to you. I'm sorry I'm not here to talk to you. You can do one thing if you want. If you want to call me, and if there's a group of you who want to call me, I can zoom into a small group where we can see one another and we can talk about things. I've done quite a few and they can be enjoyable. And they allow me to trot around the globe without getting on an airplane, and I approve of that. So God bless you all.